I'm Kaustav, as Mitra said. I'm from Kolkata. I did my bachelor's in chemistry, pure chemistry from University of Calcutta, and then changed my stream to biotechnology and did my master's from Banaras Hindu University, and then came here to Australia to pursue my PhD. And I've been here since my PhD days now as a postdoctoral research officer at the same lab. Before I start, I thought I might just give a bit about what I do so that you guys have a concept or rather you have an idea and how this research basically applies to, or rather these techniques applies to my research. Have you guys been taught about innate immune system?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
One more thing, I just want this entire lecture to be quite interactive. So please feel free to budge in, interrupt me whenever you guys have any questions. So my work is on macrophages, and I work in a specific field of immunometabolism. So I guess in your biochemistry lectures, you have read about, hello?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Yeah. I guess in your biochemistry lectures, you have read about glycolysis, TCA cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, etc. Correct?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So these days, the focus of molecular mechanism, like how an immune cell works, has shifted from signaling, like cell signaling, into metabolism. That is, we are trying to understand how metabolism, or rather change in metabolism, affects these immune cell function. And this field is called immunometabolism. So for example, when a macrophage or a T cell or a B cell gets activated, they perform various functions. For example, in macrophages, they lead, an activated macrophage leads to inflammation. A dendritic cell just processes the antigen and presents it to the T cells, and the T cell then recognizes and then launches a whole set of different functions. But how does it do so? This function of the various cell types is tightly governed by a change in metabolism. So as we keep on activating a particular cell type, metabolism changes, like because the cell has now become activated, it has to do a lot of functions, so it needs a lot of ATP. So there has to be a change in metabolism. So what I try to understand is how this change in metabolism affects macrophage function and leads to the release of various cytokines like IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, IL-6, etc., which basically works by increasing the rate of inflammation. And how my research involves several of these techniques. And two of the techniques that Mitra has asked me to share with you today are ELISA and RIA. So before I start with the actual techniques, I thought why not just recapitulate the basis of these techniques, and that is your antigen-antibody interaction. So I guess you guys have read about antigen-antibody interactions, correct?
Yes, sir.
ये करना बाकी है.
Yeah.
We were about to start it, but then lockdown started, so we have not covered this.
Okay, cool. I'll just give you a brief overview of how an antigen-antibody interaction works. So basically, an antigen-antibody interaction is nothing but a cumulative of non-covalent interactions. So amongst the various non-covalent interactions, you have the hydrogen bonding, you have the ionic bonds, wherein two different electropositive and electronegative atoms interact by electrostatic forces. You have the hydrophobic interactions, wherein a particular hydrophobic residue of the antigen is interacting with the hydrophobic residues of the antibody. You have van der Waals interaction, which is again nothing but the electron clouds of one antigen is interacting with the electron clouds of the antibodies. And finally, the ionic bonds, which is nothing but, which is again a repetition of the first one. That's an electropositive element interacting with an electronegative element. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So contrary to the belief that these interactions are not strong as compared to a covalent bond where there is actual linkage between the atoms, that's the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. These non-covalent interactions are very, very strong, and these form the basis of all antigen-antibody interactions. So when an antigen and an antibody interact, they don't form a covalent bond. They form these imaginary bonds like the hydrogen bonds, the ionic bonds, the hydrophobic interactions, the hydrophilic interactions, and the cumulative force of all these bonds together hold the antigen and the antibody together. All right? So in biochemical ways, we can basically express an antigen-antibody interaction as an antigen interacting with an antibody to give an antigen-antibody complex. All right, this is basic chemistry. Two reactants coming together to form a product. Now, when this reaction occurs, since it's a reaction, there will always be a rate constant. And this is a reversible reaction, as you can see. So in the forward reaction, the two reactants are combining to give a product. And the rate of this reaction is measured by a symbol called Ka, which is nothing but the association constant. This is basic chemistry 101. In the opposite reaction, that is, this is the reactant now, which breaks down to again give the antigen and the antibody. And the rate of this reaction is defined by a constant called the dissociation constant, and which is calculated by this thing. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it's pretty simple. So what happens in what happens to the association constant and the dissociation constant? So if the association constant is very, very high, that is Ka is very, very high, that means your numerator, that is this one, is higher than your denominators, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that means more of your antigen-antibody complex is formed. That means the reaction is proceeding in the forward direction. All right. Now, in the opposite direction, where Kd being the dissociation constant, this antigen-antibody complex is breaking down to give the antigen and the antibody. For a good antigen-antibody interaction, Kd should be very, very low because the concentration of the antigen-antibody is much, much higher than the antigen and the antibodies individually. So for a good antigen-antibody interaction, Ka should be very, very high and Kd should be very, very low. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
All right. So let me give you one example. So you have two antibodies. One is called the anti-DNP and the other is called anti-fluorescein. Anti-DNP is targeted against the antigen, this one, DNP L-lysine, and anti-fluorescein is targeted against the antigen fluorescein. I have given you the Ka values. The Ka for anti-DNP is 10 to the power 8 and the Ka of anti-fluorescein is 10 to the power 11. The subsequent Kd values are 10 to the power minus 8 for anti-DNP antibody and 10 to the power minus 11 for anti-fluorescein antibody. Now, can you tell me in these two examples, which one has a better antigen-antibody interaction? Anyone?
It's very simple. It's actually based on the above equation. Anyone who would like to try? Which antibody
Anyone?
antigen reaction will be better?
Remember, I told you a good antigen-antibody interaction happens when Ka is higher and Kd is lower.
So you fluorescein.
So keeping this in mind, can anyone tell me which antigen-antibody interaction is stronger?
Ka should be higher and Kd should be lower.
Fluorescent.
Which one?
Anyone?
Fluorescent.
Sorry?
Fluorescent. Fluorescent.
Fluorescein and
Exactly.
anti-fluorescein, exactly.
Yeah. Fluorescein, anti-fluorescein antibody, antigen-antibody interaction is the higher, because 10 to the power 11 is obviously much higher than 10 to the power 8. At the same time, 10 to the power minus 11 is much smaller than 10 to the power minus 8. So always keep this in mind, that for a strong antigen-antibody interaction, Ka should be higher and Kd should be lower.
Yes.
So this Ka and Kd forms the basis of all antigen-antibody interactions, and hence all the assays that are designed are based on this ratio of Ka and Kd. All right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So the next thing about antigen-antibody interaction that we need to know are the concepts of affinity and avidity. So the strength of an antibody is described by either its affinity or avidity. You guys know what affinity and avidity are?
Yes, sir. Avidity.
Sorry?
We have not done it yet.
Okay. So affinity is how strongly a single site of an antibody binds to a single epitope of an antigen. All right? Can everyone see the whiteboard behind me?
Yes, we can see.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
So if this is an antibody, or rather if this is an antigen, can you see this?
Yes, sir.
So it's not that clear.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
So if this antigen has 4 epitope sites. Now, when an antibody interacts with one of the epitope site, then it is called the affinity of an antigen, or of an antibody. All right? So affinity is nothing but how strongly a single site of an antibody. An antibody is like a fork, right? So one of the site, how strongly it binds to one of the epitope, is defined by the affinity of an antibody. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And avidity is how strongly all of the sites of the antibody together binds to a particular antigen. That can either be single or it can be many. This will be very clear when you see this diagram. So for instance, if you see this is an IgG. So basically this is an antibody which has 2 arms. It's like a fork. So when one arm binds to a single epitope, it is called the affinity of the antibody. All right. So in this example, one arm of IgG binds to a particular antigen with an equilibrium constant of 10 to the power 4. This is nothing but the affinity of the antibody. But since it has 2 arms, obviously the second arm will also bind to another antigen. The cumulative effect is what is called the avidity. So as you can see now, the same antibody, it has 2 arms and it is now binding to 2 antigens. And if you can see the equilibrium constant, or rather the magnitude or the numerical way we present how strongly the antigen is, the antibody is binding the antigen, it has now risen from 10 to the power 4 to 10 to the power 6, which is 100 folds higher. So that means the avidity of the antibody is higher than the affinity of the antibody. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, there are different kinds of antibodies. Usually, in the most common case, an antibody will have 2 arms like this. But there are many antibodies which form like a cluster, and hence they will be having many arms. For example, IgM. Now, IgM, as we all know, is pentavalent. That is, it has 5 different arms, and each arm has 2 of these fingers. So overall, how many fingers does it have?
10.
Huh?
10.
Exactly. So 10. So now answer this question. For the same antigen, which antibody, IgG or IgM, will have a higher avidity?
IgM.
IgM.
Reason being?
Because maximum number of possible sites to attach to the antigens.
Very good. Exactly. So IgM has a lower affinity. That is, for every arm, the way it interacts with one antigen is much smaller or weaker than IgG. But when it comes to avidity, because there are 10 arms, the cumulative sum of IgM becomes much higher. As you can see in this diagram, IgM, which has now 10 arms, has an avidity of 10 to the power 10, which is 10,000 times higher than the avidity of IgG. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So moving on from these 2 concepts of affinity, avidity, and antigen-antibody interaction, we move on to the applications of these antigen-antibody interaction. What are these antigen-antibody interactions used in? The first one is determining the strength of the antigen-antibody interaction. Why do we need to determine the strength? Because obviously we are immunologists. We have to design antibodies, be it for therapy, be it for commercial purposes. We need to design antibodies. And the strength of the antibody lies on how strongly it interacts with the antigen. And one of the ways, or one of the techniques which uses this particular concept is called surface plasmon resonance, or SPR. So in SPR, we have like a chip, and on the chip, we embed or physically embed antibodies, and then we pass antigens over it. Now, based on the antigen-antibody interaction, it's almost like catching a fish. The antibodies are on the plate, and as the antigen passes, whatever antigen is specific to the antibody, it will get stuck on the antibody. And that's how we determine how strong or how good the antibody is. And that is done by this particular technique called SPR, or surface plasmon resonance. The other thing is determination of blood serotyping. We all know that there are 3 different kinds of blood groups available, the A, B, AB, and O. And in that case, we need to obviously find out what blood type is it before we can allow transfusion. And for this, we use a technique called agglutination. Agglutination is also based on the principle of antigen-antibody interaction. How does it work? You have antigens and you have antibodies. When you mix them, they come together and they clump. And the moment they clump, the overall molecular weight of the complex, that is the antigen-antibody complex, increases and they precipitate. That is, they agglutinate. And this is the principle of agglutination reaction. So for example, you have blood type A. Now blood type A will always generate antibodies against blood type B.
Yes,
it
sir.
will not generate antibodies against blood type A, because let's say I am A positive. The antibodies inside me are against B. So if I take B, let's say I'm doing a blood transfusion on myself and I am taking in B group blood, then what happens is my antibodies, which are against the B group blood, will attack the cells and will kill them. And hence the transfusion fails. If I take in A blood, my antibodies are raised against B blood. So I can always take in A blood. So that's what happens in agglutination reaction. The moment the two blood types mismatch, the antibodies react with the antigens and they precipitate. The next example is determination of serum antibodies against bacterial antigens. And it's the same thing. It's called a bacterial agglutination reaction. Obviously, for example, if we are infected by a bacteria, the bacteria is freely flowing in our bloodstream. Whenever we know that we have been infected by a particular kind of bacteria and we want to test that, we take the blood and we mix it with an antibody that is raised against that particular bacteria. If we see that the blood gets easily clotted and it like precipitates, we know that we have been infected with that particular kind of bacteria. And that's what is an example of bacterial agglutination reaction. The next one is immunophenotyping, and which is done by a technique called flow cytometry. So flow cytometry is nothing but basically cells passing through a small nozzle at the end of which is a laser. The laser basically is targeted towards the cell, and based on how big the cell is, how small the cell is, how dense the cytoplasm of the cell is, the laser will get reflected, refracted, and diffracted. And there are obviously sensors everywhere. They catch it, and based on that, they give us an information that this is one particular kind of cell, a cell is another kind of cell. So for example, if I take blood from myself and pass it through a flow cytometer, what it does is it tells me how many cells of my blood are red blood cells, how many are white blood cells, and even amongst white blood cells, how many are eosinophils, how many are basophils, how many are T cells, how many are B cells. Because every cell is different, not only in size, but also in granularity. That is how dense the cytoplasm is. The other example of an antigen-antibody interaction is visualization of cells, bacteria, and their interaction. And that is done by a microscopy technique called immunofluorescence. So for example, let's say I have a macrophage which is infected by a bacteria, and I want to visualize the bacteria inside the macrophage by microscopy. What we do is we target the macrophages with an antibody against the bacteria. Now, bacteria is acting as an antigen. The antibody goes inside the macrophages and it basically targets, or rather encapsulates, the bacteria. Now you have the macrophage. Inside the macrophage is the bacteria, which is encapsulated by the antibody that we have added. And now what we can do is we can visualize this under a microscope. And the last example is detection of antigens for clinical purposes. A few examples being ELISA, RIA, and sorry, did anyone say something?
The time will end in 10 minutes, so maybe we can just wrap it up.
How long is the
40 minutes.
Oh, remaining time is 10 minutes. Okay, I'll try to wrap it up quickly.
Yeah,
So the next thing is basically the techniques, that's ELISA, RIA, and immunoprecipitation. So let me move on to the first technique, that is your RIA. So RIA is basically a radio immunoassay. So we are utilizing the concept of radioactivity in this assay. So what we do in this case is it involves a competition between radio-labeled antigens and an unlabeled antigen for a particular amount of antibody. So how do we do that? So we take antibodies and we add radio-labeled antigens of a particular kind. So the moment we take a radio-labeled antigen, all the antibody sites are bound by that radio-labeled antigen. As we keep increasing the concentration of unlabeled antigen, this unlabeled antigen displaces the radio-labeled antigen from the antibody sites. As a result, the total radioactivity of the sample reduces. A standard curve is then prepared, first by gradually increasing the known amount of unlabeled antigen against a fixed amount of radio-labeled antigen. And radioactivity is recorded at every dose. And finally, when the standard curve is drawn against the unknown amount of antigen, this is calculated from this standard curve. This is a lot simpler when we move on to the next slide. And one thing to remember is the sensitivity of this assay is you can go as low as 1 nanograms per milliliter of the antigen. So, for example, I'll skip this bit. You can just read it. It's very simple. What particular kind of radio-labeled antigens we use, and that is mainly your tritium or hydrogen-3, which is a beta emitter, or an iodine 125, which is a gamma emitter. And there are reasons why we use iodine 125, and the advantages and disadvantages are listed. But let's move on to the step-by-step procedure. So the first thing is preparing a standard curve. So let's assume we want to assess the amount of antigen X in a particular blood sample. You have to keep this in mind that antigen X, the identity of antigen X is known to us. So what do? We prepare radio-labeled antigen X. We take a known quantity of antigen X and we radio-label them with iodine 125. We then take a 96-well plate and we coat the entire plate with the antibody against antigen X. We then add a known supersaturating amount of radio-labeled antigen X to the well, and then we wash the wells to remove any of the unbound radio-labeled antigen. So we are considering the fact that all the antibody sites.
I'm so sorry to.
Hello?
5 minutes
Yeah.
left. 5 minutes left.
Okay. Very quickly. So we are taking this into account that all of the radio-labeled antigens are bound to the antibody. So we then keep adding variable quantity of unlabeled antigen. As we keep on increasing the unlabeled antigen, the radioactive antigen is displaced from the antibody, and hence the overall radioactivity with known quantities of unlabeled antigen. And then when we measure the radioactivity of the unknown sample, we just extrapolate it to the standard curve, and that's how we get the quantity of the unlabeled antigen. So the next bit is basically the advantages, the disadvantages, and the applications, which are pretty simple. I'll quickly get on to what ELISA is. ELISA is exactly similar to RIA, except that it's much non-hazardous because it does not involve radioactivity and it involves an enzyme. Now, why is it called a ELISA or enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay? It is called an immunoassay because it involves antigens and antibodies. The antibody is physically adsorbed on a surface, that is, it's stuck to a surface, and the antibody is conjugated to an enzyme. So if you see this, basically you have a surface on which we attach an antibody, and we then add the antigen that we want to analyze. We then allow a secondary antibody which is conjugated to an enzyme, which is this TARMA. And then when we add the substrate then changes the color, and the intensity of the color basically is proportional to the amount of antigen present. Now there are three different kinds of ELISAs. One is called direct and one is called indirect ELISA. Direct ELISA is when instead of coating the antibodies on the surface, we are adding the antigens on the surface. We add the antigen and then we add the antibody against that antigen, and this antigen, this antibody is conjugated to the enzyme. And when we add the substrate, the enzyme acts on the substrate, changes color, and that's how we get a measure of how much of the antigen is present. Indirect ELISA is just like direct ELISA, but it involves an additional antibody. So you have antigens stuck on the surface, we add a primary antibody, which is against the antigen. And then we add a secondary antibody, which is against the primary antibody, but coupled to the enzyme. And then when you add the substrate, it changes from one particular color to the other. And the intensity of the color is directly proportional to the amount of antigens present. These are basically the advantages and the disadvantages of direct and indirect ELISA. It's mainly the sensitivity and the cross-reactivity that you have to keep in mind. The next and the most important bit is sandwich ELISA. So sandwich ELISA is what we immunologists do every day. So sandwich ELISA is nothing but just like a sandwich, you have two breads and in between the bread is your filling. You have a primary or captured antibody, which is stuck to the surface. You add your antigen. The antigen is then recognized by a detection antibody on the top. That is this is your bottom bread. Your filling is your antigen. You add your secondary antibody, which is your top bread. And this top bread basically has the enzyme attached to it. So when you add the substrate is acted on by the enzyme, changes from one particular color to the other. So basically a primary antibody specific to the particular antigen is coated on the wells. The sample to be assessed is then added, which is your filling. And then a secondary antibody, which is specific to a different epitope, but of the same antigen. So basically the antigen is detected underneath by one particular antibody and above it by another antibody. This secondary antibody is conjugated to an enzyme and a chromogenic substrate is added, which changes the color from one to the other. And again, the intensity of the color is directly proportional to how much of the antigen is present. Again, for the same thing, how is it calculated?
I'd like to interrupt again, Kaustav.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute left. I think so. We should.
Yeah, I'm wrapping it up.
Yes.
So it is again
huge amount of thanks from all my students, and there was a small request from the students if you can share the PPT.
Yes, sure. I'll send it to you, and you can then share it with your students.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So it's just 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Last thing is basically.
Please continue.
These are some of the suggested readings, mainly from Kubi or Janeway, if you can get access to it. And if you have any other questions, I've also provided my email ID.
Sure.
And I'm happy to take this class all over again
Sure.
any other day. I'm also kind of under lockdown, so I have nothing to do out here.